Okay, so looking at me, the next thing that I'm going to say might sound a little bit weird, but I really didn't think of myself as being Chinese until I was around 18 years old. You see, I grew up in post-colonial, multi-ethnic Trinidad, with the words of our first Prime Minister kind of echoing in my mind. There can be no Mother Africa, no Mother India. We were essentially taught to distance ourselves from our ancestry in order to embrace being better citizens of our relatively new nation. So I thought of myself as Trinidadian, and I embraced all the other cultures of my home as my own. And being Asian was just a tiny little part of my identity. That is, until I went overseas for university. And as soon as I stepped abroad, I realized that to the rest of the world, I was pretty much 100% Chinese. Now, I would end up living and working overseas for over a decade, and I continually had to answer questions that went along the lines of, why do you sound a little bit like Bob Marley, but you look like that? And honestly, it wasn't really until I was in my mid-20s or so that something about this line of questioning struck a chord with me. I just recently graduated from my first degree, which was mostly rooted in like a very deep, rigorous scientific fact-based theory, biology and chemistry, with a tiny element of anthropology. And I was at the cusp of my career in global health, which is what I would go on to study for my master's. I'd found myself then living and working in Ethiopia on a really interesting project trying to better understand sexual health behaviors in communities so different to my own. What I was quickly learning was, of course, the facts are important, prevalence of diseases, the economic situations. But in order for me to better understand and to really feel connected to those people, and by extension, those communities, I needed to listen to those life stories, their life experiences, and to learn a little bit more about the cultures and the histories that they were from. Now, of course, every good relationship or respectful one goes both ways. But I found myself struggling because I didn't really understand some parts of my own story and my own history. Because it's true, compared to the average person in the world, I sound a little bit more like Bob Marley. But I am Asian. So what was the real story behind that? Now, in 2012, when I returned home, I became, frankly, a little bit obsessed with recording my then 82-year-old grandmother's stories. I would sit with her Sunday lunch after Sunday lunch and ask her tons of questions. And slowly, the anecdotes started to come out. She told me how she lost the grocery store that she built with my grandfather in the 1980s to a fire, and that not long after that, she became the main breadwinner of our family of 7 when she lost her father, her husband, and her mother in the same year. And that she started a tiny little business in her backyard to make preserved mangoes to support everyone. I knew that I had to record those stories. And what came out of that was a little film that unexpectedly made it into 2 international film festivals. I have vivid memories of that first screening. I was standing there with my granny by my side in front of this gigantic cinema screen in the theater. And I was readying myself to answer all the audience's questions. But as soon as those questions started to come out, my granny brushed me aside, hand on hip, and started sassily answering the audience. I had to take a step back in that moment because, honestly, it was the first time that I really ever saw her as a woman in her own right, and not as just my granny. Now, because she had opened up and shared her story, other people in the audience started to reflect on their own and started to share those with us. And there was this unmistakable feeling of connection in that room right there and then. And this was really big because when I started that project with my granny, she would tell me, what stories or what do I have to say? I'm just an average person. You are just being my crazy granddaughter as usual, embarking on some project that I have no idea what it means. But in that moment, my grandmother was standing with pride. She understood that her story mattered. And she was no longer just that faceless stereotype of that Chinese woman with a grocery store on the corner. That reinforced for me all that I had learned working in communities, whether it was in Uganda or Ethiopia, the US or the UK or the Caribbean, that it's this really interesting blend of human experiences placed within the factual context and the history and the cultures that can give us interesting and genuine insights into who we are and how we're connected to other people. So, of course, being the crazy grandchild that I am, I decided, right, I'm going to start a company to help people all over the world tell their stories. And that is exactly what my team and I have been doing for the past 5 years. We've listened to thousands of hours of interviews, combed over the most beautiful of archives from all over the world, and read countless history books in order to help our clients tell their own stories. Now, that time with my grandmother, helping her to record her legacy, was the best gift I could have ever given her. But as she was telling me her story and my ancestors' stories, what I realized was that she was actually gifting me with the best gift that she ever could, my story, a better understanding of myself and my place in this world. I was learning that our family was in the Caribbean because my grandmother left China in 1949, not speaking a word of English, to marry a man she had never met before as a mail order bride in a country absolutely foreign to her own. I learned that we were from a part of China in the south called Guangdong, and that I, like her, am from a tribe called the Hakka. Did not mean that I also shared connections to people in Guangdong. And what about all the people in the world who are Hakka, like me? I learned afterwards that Hakka women were warrior women. They didn't bind their feet for beauty. They stood beside the men and defended our villages. They were resilient and they were migratory. Traits that I saw in my grandmother, the other woman in my family, and in myself. She told me about how over the century, our family made its way through Suriname, Guyana, the UK, the US, Jamaica. Might not mean that I also shared something with those parts of the world as well. As my grandmother was telling me her story and really our family's story and my story, I began to understand and to see this amazingly beautiful tapestry that was unfolding with strings that connected me to people and to places all over the world. And I had never really thought about that from that perspective before. And it really made me feel and to understand just how much I am a citizen of this world. But my granny wasn't only opening up connections through geographical space. What she was doing was also opening up those connections across time. She recounted how she escaped the violence of the Second Sino-Japanese War, running to Hong Kong, hiding in trenches, eating and surviving off of nothing but biscuits made of just flour and water. I learned about the historical facts surrounding those events, but listening to her stories gave a human dimension to those things that connected me to the past in a way that no historical piece of paper ever could. My grandmother was a part of history, an active player, as we all are, every day in the decisions that we make that will impact the people who come after us. My very existence is because of those decisions that my grandmother made within historical circumstances that are not so different to some that are unfolding in our world today. I mean, I stand here before you, the granddaughter of a refugee. Now, I know it sounds a little bit like a remarkable journey to a certain degree, almost a bit idyllic in many ways. But in fact, delving into my family's story and my own story was one of the most destabilizing periods of my life. Kind of like when you are driving full speed and you think, all right, I'm good, I know where I'm going, determined, and you see and you hit the biggest speed bump ever, and you go flying, freewheeling, not sure how, where, and in what state you're going to land in. Because life stories will unveil those really wonderful gems, but they will also probably show you things about yourself and about others, those you love the most sometimes, and about society that you really sometimes don't ever want to confront. Stories with themes like blame, shame, and lies, and tragedy and loss and fear. Like learning that I come from 3 generations of abandoned children and having to dig deep and deal with those feelings and seeing how that impacted myself and my other family members and being terrified of repeating those cycles. And you may also desperately seek answers to questions that you will have to accept are lost with time. So you have to be prepared, and you do have to remember that it is in your own time that you're doing this. But what I've learned through my personal experiences and all of my years of work is that struggling through these very unsettling realizations can often be one of the best things you go through, because you tend to come out on the other side with a more grounded sense of self, the ability to think a little bit more critically about those stereotypes that we're sometimes conditioned to see, and to be more empathetic to the people around you, because we are all going through crazy journeys. And I really believe that this can help us to be a more respectful and kinder society as we try to maneuver these rapid changes in our world together. Now, I can't help myself but think sometimes about this amazing, beautiful tapestry of humanity that we are all connected to in some way. And I just think, imagine how many possible points of connection you and I could have with each other if we better understood the places all over the world, the times, past, present, and future, and the experiences, whether those are good or bad, that we inherit from our ancestors. But my concern is this: every day we lose hundreds and thousands of lives all over the world. Just think of how many stories and how many possible connections that we've lost just with me standing in front of you here today. People always come up to me now and tell me that they wish that they had recorded the stories of their loved ones while they were alive or while their memories were still intact. So, what have you done to record your own legacy today? And it's the easiest thing to do. Go home and speak with a loved one. Find that crazy eccentric aunt or uncle or community member who really is like the informal historian now. Or document your own story. Just turn your smartphone on, record a conversation, record a blurry video, or scribble down some notes. It really doesn't have to be perfect. And I promise you that you will begin to see the beauty in every message scrolled across the back of a photograph, or within all those letters that you may have inherited, or when you uncover those facts that help you to better understand why somebody else made a decision. Just don't wait for too long, because the people that you love, the ones whose stories in many ways define who you are and how you are connected to others in the world, they won't be around forever. My grandmother is now 87 years old, and I still record her stories all the time. Do it. The people who are around you and those who will come after you, they will appreciate and cherish this really precious gift long after you're gone. Thank you.